Almost.
Oh, are we live? Are we live right
I,
now?
I think we're live, yeah.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
he-
Okay.
Hello and welcome to the Anime Writers stream. I'm the Anime Writers, and today we have two special guests. We have a co-host as usual. Say hello, Kayak,
Hello.
and we have a special guest that we wanted to have on for quite some time. Say hello, and Hasan.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
All right. Yeah.
Where's the
So
screen? I
today,
can't see it. Oh, sorry.
yeah, I think it's going on. Unless I'm not mistaken. This is the kind of quality planning that we are capable of here on the Anime Writers Show.
Yeah.
So today we wanted to talk about natural law and specifically one specific aspect of natural law, namely the so-called perverted faculty argument, which I think all of us agree is kind of important because um, ex contra naturam, they're like an important part of um, Catholic moral teaching, but also if you look at like just any part of the natural law tradition, you kind of need some account of why certain things would be wrong under the natural law. What is your guys' familiarity with the debate? Like, I think we all talked about that argument at some point. Hasan, since Kayak is muted, seemingly.
Well, I think a lot of the debate has to do with like, whether or not people admit that there is a natural kind that we can call human in the first place. That's one of the central pivots, right?
Yeah.
My field in anthropology is definitely extremely hostile to this and calls it essentialism. So I've had a lot of run-ins with this problem in my own recent history working in this field.
Yeah, I don't envy you in regards to this. Things are a bit better in philosophy. Essentialism is, at least in parts of like theoretical philosophy, not as unpopular. But I don't think it's that often talked about in relation to ethics. Kayak, what's your like engagement with the perverted faculty argument?
I think the main question is actually it's going to be about meta ethics, specifically about whether or not, in the words of Ben Watkins, goodness is a good making property, or goodness is something being good for some end, right?
Right.
And with the argument, the entire argument, it hinges upon this, because the argument will basically go that such and such is bad for not the natural telos of certain organs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that because of that, it's bad, right? Like the argument, it requires that. I suppose you have to explain how like morality is tied into respect of these goals inherent in nature and
Right.
the parts of the human being. 90% of the debate is just going to be over whether or not goodness is a great making or a good making property, because if it is, then there's no intelligible objection to natural law theory, and if it's not, well then they might be able to have a case, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm glad that you mentioned the sort of problem of like the teleology of certain organs, because I think that I agree with you that the teleology of organs is important, but I think that it's almost like a step ahead of where we should best start, because there's like there's this popular objection to the sort of perverted faculty argument, which I think is usually called the chewing gum objection. The objection, like I think everyone is more or less familiar with it, essentially usually takes the kind of form of, well, you see, you're claiming that the perversion of a faculty, as in something like an act of lying or like a debauched sexual act, is essentially bad because of the frustration of the faculty. But what about the chewing of chewing gum? Like, doesn't that frustrate the faculty of like whatever kind of bodily instrument your mouth is, or your jaw is? And well, next to the fact that I'm wondering if that kind of argument begs the question, I do think that like one of the first things to start with really here is not so much just looking at the telos of individual organs, which sounds a bit autistic, but just starting with like a solid definition of virtue. I don't know what you guys think about that.
Yeah, that's a good place to start, because natural law theory it'll tie into rationality of action. It'll tie into theological issues. It'll tie into all these things which require the concept of virtue. They require the concept of habit, dispositions of the human being, etc.
Yeah, right. So this is one of the things that I'm thinking about. I'm glad that you mentioned the rationality of the acts, or like man is like acting rationally, kayak, because I think that one of the important aspects of something like the perverted faculty argument is, like, if you look at Thomas Aquinas' definition of ex contra naturam, it's very much based on like ex contra naturam also being ex contra reason. So, yeah, Hasan, do you want to add anything to like this as a starting point, like discussion of virtue as a starting point? Hasan?
Sorry?
Yeah, so Kayak and I just said that, when you want to talk about like the perverted faculty argument within natural law, I think that even though the teleology of organs, body parts will play a role in the argument, I think a decent point to start is just the nature of virtue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, do you want to add something to this?
Well, virtue is effectively going to be divided into habit and act, but it specifically concerns the propensity of or the tendency of the human will, or the promptitude of the human will to act in accordance with its nature, which, when we consider the will as human, that has to do with the proper ends of the various faculties that the human soul is made up of.
Right. So it's interesting when we're talking now about virtue, because if you look at someone like Elizabeth Anscombe, she will say, well, if we're looking at like what is virtue within the sexual realm, since like sexual acts are like some of the acts that human beings engage in, since theory of virtue is like all about, like as you said, the acts and habits that human beings engage in. We would assume that there's such a thing as like a theory of virtue relating to sexual activity, and the virtues related to that Anscombe calls chastity, which, well, yeah.
Yeah, that fairly. I mean, everybody calls it chastity.
Right. Now, I think it's also like worthwhile to note that when we're talking about virtue in regards to like sexual activity, we're essentially talking about like a particular kind of social virtue. Would you guys say that's fair to say? Because we're talking about like social activity and guys?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so because we're dealing with social activity, we're obviously dealing with a particular mode of social activity, and that means that we, in order to distinguish it from other kinds, we now have to invoke other kinds of social activity. I would argue that we now have to invoke certain ends. I think this is kind of interesting insofar as are you guys familiar? Alexander Proust once held a talk about like love and love within sexual Christian sexual ethics.
No.
Nope. I don't know
Oh yeah,
anything about.
so he essentially made what I think is the fairly compelling argument that as with all other social activity to a certain extent, we're more or less discussing love here and like the appropriate nature that love plays in certain social interactions. In like in a sort of remote sense, like a doctor, as an example, has love for his patient when he tries
Sure.
to help him.
Sure.
So just in a way of like what the kind of relationship is that someone is engaging in, that relationship will be distinguished from other social relationships. And because that relationship is then distinct from other social relationships, the one thing that should distinguish it as an act is the end of the act. I think we can all kind of agree so far. And I think this is essentially where we should then kind of get into like the main bulk of the perverted faculty argument. So as kayak said, like the perverted faculty argument is very much concerned with the teleology of bodily functions, but as we already discussed, it is related to this in accordance with certain virtues. So essentially what this means for us is that we would argue that within certain social acts, which certain of these acts would be virtues, others would not be, others would be the contrary to that. This has this essentially has implications for us now in regards to how we how we act, because obviously virtue is related to natural inclination in man, so it's very much related to faculties in man, since ultimately every act of a living creature is, in a sense, as I've mentioned in the first video on natural law, an act that is directed towards self-perfection. So in a sense, it terminates in the creature itself again. even if it's a social act. And because of that, it's related very much to the faculties at place in a human being. Now, if certain kinds of distinct acts, because of the goals that they are generally directed towards, involve certain kinds of faculties of man, then these faculties will, and their ends will play a role in the efficacy of the acts. I think you guys would agree so far.
Yeah, definitely.
Right. As an example, I think like we don't always have to use like examples within like sexual ethics, even those are probably the most popular ones for obvious reasons. But we could probably start with something like lying, which is often like this second most popular example of like an act contra naturam. Now, lying is an act that happens during communication, and obviously, like communication too is in a sense like a social phenomena. Where as man we're communicating with each other. It's part of our nature to be social, since man is a social animal. He's also a rational animal, so he will convey his sociology in a manner that is like in accordance with his rational nature, and that involves communication with his fellow man. And obviously, within communication, we would ultimately, also among other things, like transmit information. In fact, this kind of seems to be one of the most central aspects of communication, since communication entails such things as propositions. Obviously, there's also like social context cues and the like, part of communications. But like the informational content of communication is one of the central aspects of it as well. And because of that, it will be a central aspect of communication that it confirms some kind of truth. Now, the interesting thing about lying then is that on the one hand, it's an act, it's a social act, and it's a speech act. As a speech act,
it goes against our nature as rational animals,
right? And
by opposing rationality.
Yeah, and I would argue that like the interesting thing about lying is that on the one hand, it's clearly kind of in the general sphere of like the kind of act that's supposed to be. It's a speech. Again, it's a speech act as well. But as we already determined, there are certain aspects that speech acts ought to have in fulfilling their ends. We can kind of see what speech acts are for, how they fit in within the social and rational nature of man, and so every act of speech is essentially directed towards this. So whenever it falls short of this, it's a bad speech act. Now, if it falls voluntarily short of this, it's not just a bad speech act, but it becomes morally vicious behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, do you want to add something to that, Kayak?
Yeah. Wait. Let Hasan speak.
No, I haven't got anything to say yet.
Yeah. There's been things happening in my life that are very clearly reflecting that. Specifically. But I don't want to talk about them.
Yeah, that's that's fair.
Right.
Goodness, this is a bit of an awkward stream today, more than usual.
Well, to be fair to your viewers, we didn't really have a lot of time to prepare.
Because I forgot that it was on Wednesday, because I was thinking it was going to be on like Saturday, but I forgot that I promised it on Wednesday.
I'm open to do a rerun of this once I get to prepare properly.
I mean, we could probably do a second stream on this topic.
Sure. You seem like you've prepared quite a few things. Actually, you've got.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I tend to go through like some of the relevant literature before talking about this stuff, and I sometimes take notes.
Cool.
But yeah, I think having this kind of view of like what exactly the perverted faculty argument is embedded within.
Leave yourself. Oh dear. Kayak.
I thought I had myself muted. Sorry.
So, interestingly enough, within the context of what the perverted faculty argument is, I think this embedding within a wider theory of virtue already does it a lot of does it a favor, because within the first video, we talked about, or I talked about, because it was still just like a recorded video and not a stream with a co-host or something. I talked about the nature of a natural law and the odds within natural law, and that we're essentially talking about, whenever we're talking about moral imperatives in virtue ethics and natural law theory, we're essentially talking about hypothetical imperatives. So the interesting thing, as I already talked about in that video with hypothetical imperatives, is that they classify as both, well, imperative statements, so statements that prescribe action, but at the same time they're quite objective statements. As an example, I think that's also an example that I may have used in that video. Is like if someone is if someone's trying to catch a bus and he already sees the bus ready to go at a bus stop, if he still wants to catch a bus, he probably needs to run. Now, interestingly enough, we can all agree that that's a factual statement, yet it's also a prescriptive statement because it's prescribing a certain kind of action. So in a sense, we have, from the concept of a hypothetical imperative alone, we already have a measurement of good action. Now, the interesting thing about action, though, is that various actions are, in a sense, instrumental. Like, as an example, if we're asking why I want to catch that bus, it's probably in reference to something else. Like, perhaps I need to get to school. If I need to get to school, it's probably because I want to learn something, and we can push this forward and forward. Now, I think Aristotle made in compelling case very early on within the Nicomachean ethics that this kind of chain of instrumental actions, even though every one of them will probably themselves already give an account of what would be a good action within that circumstance, it really can only be measured in a moral sense if there's like a sort of ultimate yardstick for it. So we cannot have like a series of instrumental ends ad infinitum, but rather we need this to terminate definitively. And of course, the way to do this within the theory of virtue ethics is to have this terminate by appealing to some to some end it's ultimately pointing towards. Now, Aristotle was wondering whether that end is external and internal. And even though this kind of gets a bit more nuanced with the theological discussion attached to it, in a sense, it's internal insofar as we argued early on in this video. An act within virtue ethics is, in a sense, directed towards the perfection of the agent. So since a good is a perfection of a particular thing and not just good in a Platonic sense, it has explanatory power with reference to a thing's nature. We really need to keep the nature of a thing in mind when we're talking about good and bad, and that obviously, on the one hand, means that a moral behavior ultimately boils down to talk about action and habits, insofar as habits and habitual behavior can be fitting for living beings, since living substances, meaning not just human beings, but especially also animals, then they're not just defined by perhaps their physical composition, but also by what would essentially be actions that seem to be essential to them. So really, it's like their mode of operation, their mode of behavior that's also important to them. And obviously, because of this, habits and inclinations towards certain behaviors will be fitting or unfitting for any kind of a particular rational substance or living substance. And because of that, certain habits will be fitting and unfitting, certain actions will be fitting and unfitting.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously, that shouldn't be in contradiction to what like the sort of strictly bodily ends of that thing are.
Mm-hmm.
You probably want to add something, Kayak.
Yeah, and another thing to consider, so with rationality, one of these ends to which speech acts are going to be instrumental is to obtain the truth, to know what's true, right? Meaning
Yeah.
that certain habits and then certain like perversions of speech are just frustrating like the end of seeking truth, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and that isn't entirely going to be like separate from sexual ethics, because a lot of these are going to themselves be like sexual behaviors.
Yeah, exactly. I think we already talked about lying and speech acts a little bit. I think we would both agree that, like, insofar as language is an example that has propositional content, right?
Yes.
And that, like, because of this, it's quite clear that, like, every act of language is like an act of communication of some truth. Now, we should probably kind of go back to the to the sexual ethics part, and like,
Mm-hmm.
would you like to elaborate on like the relation between truth and sexual?
Oh, uh, wait, let me take this check.
Well, Kai is typing something. Hasan posted in the chat. Now, the virtues are nothing but those perfections whereby reason is directed to God, and the inferior powers regulated according to the dictate of reason. So yeah, that's from the Summa Theologia. Help me out, Hasan. Prima pars, question 90, question 95, Article 3.
Yeah, so this is my preferred way of citing from it at the moment. It basically just works by taking the Aquinas.cc link and taking the reference from there. So it's going to be second part of the it's going to be prima pars, question 95, article 3, and that's the respondeo.
Yeah, that works very well.
Yep.
Also, Kayak, you back?
Yeah.
So we wanted to talk about a link. Damn, he's
Yeah,
muted again.
yeah. So can we return to the question of sexual ethics, please?
Yeah, this link between sexual ethics and truth. Exactly. Go ahead.
Well, yeah. So, there's certain behaviors which just exist to frustrate the end of truth. Namely, there are certain ways of attracting females, which just involve like clever lying. Right.
Right.
For example, flirting.
Hasan, do you want to comment on this?
Well, when he says flirting, he means specific kinds of flirting.
Yeah.
All right, fair. Yeah.
There's a particular example that comes to mind.
That's why I'm kind of.
Yeah. Can I tell it?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So, a girl tells a guy who does have autism. A girl tells a guy, "Oh, I have hamsters in my bedroom. You should come take a look." And he follows because he wants to see the hamsters. And he goes in. There's no freaking hamsters. So he starts screaming uncontrollably in anger at this deception. Whereas another guy would have just been like, "Well, no hamsters, but I'm in a girl's bedroom now, so I don't care."
This is really kind of reminds me of there's this meme like where a girl said, "Let's go upstairs. By the way, do you have protection?" And the guy responds, "Protection from what? I'm scared." Sorry, it's a bad joke.
That was stupid.
Yeah, but it's kind of funny. Let's be honest.
All right. So now let's return to Ben Watkins and the perverted faculties argument.
Yeah, let's talk about Ben Watkins. For those who don't know, Ben Watkins is one of the hosts of the Real Atheology podcast, which I never listened to, but these guys are very active on Twitter. And Ben Watkins is quite famous for like objecting to, classical theism, but also like natural law theory. And his objections are a little odd. Let's describe them like that.
Yeah, his objections will go like, well, if natural law theory is true, then how come there's nothing wrong with being gay, right? Like that's basically his objection. Oh, if the perverted faculties argument doesn't works, then how come I can chew gum? Oh, if or even better, recently he just made this tweet where basically the tweet just involved saying that natural law theory is wrong. It's wrong. Because it doesn't tell you what the good making properties of the actions are. In his own words.
This guy. Yeah.
Yeah, nobody likes Ben Watkins.
It reminds me of that one guy who wrote a commentary on the Summa, and when he gets to the point where Aquinas says fornication is against nature and that's why it's not allowed, he goes, Aquinas doesn't explain what he means by nature here, so therefore his argument doesn't matter.
Oh, you mean Brian Davies, I think?
Yes.
Yeah, which is a shame because like Brian Davies' like content on Thomism is usually really good.
I know that was one really embarrassing place because it's like, hey, you just commented on the places where he explains what nature is. What do you mean?
Right. Yeah, but like, I mean, Ben Watkins' sort of argument against natural law theory kind of tickles my autism on like multiple levels. For one, just dealing with from a strictly historical point of view, just dealing with very particular Thomistic accounts of natural law and saying, here's my like not so good objection to this. Therefore, natural law debunked is really ineffective once you realize that like there are multiple variations of natural law theory, but also besides that, like the bubblegum argument, as I hope we have already hinted at, is such a silly argument given that I mean, I could imagine that chewing gum uh, might be a vice under particular circumstances, but we're ultimately talking about like the virtuous use of faculties, or like faculties in relation with certain basic human inclinations towards virtue.
Mm-hmm.
So I think like and now you're doing first of that, like there's a question of like if you're showing something while only taking in little or a negligible amount of like nutrition, like I think the argument can be made that that alone doesn't warrant being called like a perversion of a faculty, but also beyond that, like the important part is that like a perversion of a faculty is not just like using something for like a secondary end. It's like performing like a very particular act directed towards like a very particular kind of virtuous habit, and doing it in a way that like voluntarily um, frustrates that sort of like inclination towards virtue.
Yeah, well, what I would mention here is that some of the faculties are kind of like contained within or directed to the good of others, first of all. And second, I would argue that actually, in many cases, chewing gum is against temperance, not in some major way, but definitely contrary to its development.
Oh yeah, sure. That's
Yeah.
why I said it can be viceful behavior under certain
Yeah,
circumstances.
yeah. Like imagine if you instead of just chewing some gum, you like chewed every single day, uh like 10 or 20 gum tablets. All right. Now imagine that you're Nikocado avocado doing it. Okay, now we're talking perversion of faculties.
Yeah,
Uh yeah, so there's going to be a matter of degree here because uh if you chew a certain amount of gum, then like the consequences which you will know it will have upon your health will be such that it constitutes self-harm, right? Which will
yeah.
pervert your other faculties, right? Uh Significant levels of self-harm might in fact even harm your ability to use reason. Uh like
Exactly.
like significant levels of like gluttony. Yeah, because it can cause like damage to your like bodily health, can cause damage to your mental health, for example. And a great example of this would be Nikocado avocado.
Elaborate. I'm not familiar with.
Oh, yeah. So Nikocado avocado is this guy. He used to be like a really healthy vegan channel who like reviewed health food, and then he became a mukbang channel, right? And then he became like absurdly mentally ill, like in a matter of a year or so. And he made a promise that he would he would like stop doing the mukbang videos when he turned 30 years old. Uh, and then he turned 30 years old and he didn't stop making the videos, right? He's kind of like a meme here, which is why I brought him up. It's like a meme on YouTube, because everybody will know who I'm talking about, besides you apparently. Uh, but yeah, that's like a clear example where excess in eating certain foods can in fact pervert faculties, can even hamper your use of reason, and it constitutes like self-harm, quite literally. Like he's just destroying his body by doing this. Yeah. Whereas if you're only chewing like I don't know, like one tablet of gum, because those consequences, you have no reason to expect them. You wouldn't clearly be acting against you wouldn't be frustrating your faculties in a way nearly as clearly as if you're a mukbang YouTuber, for example. But yeah, so the degree actually does matter, not just the kind, because certain consequences of the action which you can expect will change depending upon what the degree is, and then you could be by means of that action doing something else which does in fact frustrate your faculties, namely becoming like a gluttonous, mentally ill, horrifically fat person who is like 600 pounds or whatever, right? Like you could become that, and it right. So the degree does matter, and then there'll be the other question, which is, okay, but like, what's wrong with saying you like chew like a little bit of gum, and that does in fact constitute a device, as long as you know that could in fact be harmful to your health, and it could introduce harm, that it could cause you to gain bad habits if you repeatedly do it, which could develop into something worse. Like, it's unclear like why chewing gum is entirely like it's entirely per accidence sinless, right?
Mm-hmm.
The argument just seems to like the chewing gum argument. Another thing is that it doesn't seem to make a distinction between per se and per accidens, like being contrary to nature, being morally repugnant, right? It doesn't
Yeah,
make a distinction between whether the act is per se or per accidens, because you can obviously think of examples where chewing gum is more like immoral, right? In fact, you could argue that these aren't even that uncommon. And most people would actually agree to this. Like, excess of eating harmful foods and damaging your health. Like, nobody thinks this is good, right? And
exactly.
not even Ben Watkins does, I'm sure.
In fact, I think the chewing gum example is a little bit funny because have you ever watched the movie Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory?
Yes. Yes, I actually had that in mind earlier.
Which one?
Yeah, the original, the 70s one.
Yo.
So you'll probably remind when the so who's that one girl who chews chewing gum all time?
Well, she chews
Veronica?
the same gum each time. I don't know what her name is. I don't remember.
Veronica something.
Yeah. And so when she gets knocked out by Willy Wonka, let's describe it like that. You know, the Oompa
Veruca.
Loompas.
Veruca Salt was her name.
I think Veruca's the other girl. Veruca's like the spoiled girl.
Oh yeah, you're right. Violet Beauregard. The gum
That might
chewer.
be it.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, it's the gum
Yeah,
chewer.
I think the Oompa Loompas sing something that's very critical of a constant gum chewing, which kind of implies that back in the 70s at least, excessive gum chewing was kind of viewed as a bad habit and like was at least like not really in accordance with like some softer social mores. So yeah, like I think the gum chewing argument against the perverted faculty argument is kind of all at once you realize that like gum chewing has been part of moral considerations, not as drastically as with like something like the sexual faculties or like communicative faculties, because well, there are different degrees here. I think Hassan, you already hinted at it. Like one of the things that makes certain acts of lying and like acts of sexual morality like particularly bad is pretty much the social, also like the frustration of the social ends that they're directed towards.
Hmm.
And that they're not just like intemperate in a sense, but they're also like they damage something,
Well,
or they frustrate something. But
it's going to be whether these are intentionally done, just in general. But here, it's a lot harder to show because oftentimes these systemic distortions of communication will, in fact, be so widespread that they're completely unintentional, right?
oh yeah, sure. I mean, like
so the criticism will be less of the moral agent than of the act itself, the act of saying it this way, right?
right. Remember, in philosophy of language, we also have we don't just have semantics. We also have like what's the second?
Pragmatics.
Yeah, pragmatics.
Which does deal with like ends of certain acts of communication.
Right.
Like John Searle, for instance, talks about the perlocutionary point and illocutionary point of speech acts, which are taken to be like purposes or goals behind them. Yeah. Trying to charge my computer. Sorry.
But yeah, obviously, like the social context of certain, like we do say certain things that we don't quite mean literally, and like we do use because there's like a contextual meaning attached to them. So obviously, that I think that's like different because obviously that's the only proposition that's revealed isn't just like the most obvious proposition contained within that sentence, but also like the other propositions essentially revealed within the way that things are phrased within the context.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, what are other examples of like ex contra naturam, or like the perversion of faculties? I think like obviously someone another popular one is let's say someone was had like an eating disorder and would make themselves vomit out the food that they've just consumed every time after like a meal.
Yeah, that would be a clear one as well.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it would be just like for the very sort of classical, typical reasons. In this case, we're dealing with like a clear sort of.
Well, one example that I remember from when I was young was that my grandparents were very conscious that staying in bed just for the pleasure of it when you no longer need to sleep is wrong. That would be another one.
I'm not sure if that's like a perversion of a faculty.
Well, not necessarily, but it's the enjoyment of sleep as a sort of like tactable, and the restfulness that comes from it as a kind of tactable sensation. So it's a kind of abuse of the faculty of touch in a specific sense.
Well, yeah, sure, in a sense.
Yeah. It's not very clearly against nature, but there's this particular function of the body that is not being used very well.
Mm-hmm.
But to be fair, like some people read in bed.
Yes.
Which I'm not sure if that's like against any sort of like ethical.
Yeah, no, that isn't.
No, it wouldn't be, but it could be. It could be said to be a kind of practice against the development of certain virtues, not necessarily contra naturam.
Oh yeah, sure, but like at this point we're kind of back to like practical reasoning and its place in virtue, where obviously like there's a kind of like degree of planning and like trying to have some degree of measure in your actions that's kind of necessary for a
True.
virtuous life.
Well, an obvious one would be idolatry, but
Yeah, right. I mean, this is a very obvious one. People usually don't necessarily think about it, but I think this actually kind of related to something that Anscombe said, because like in a sense it's like a clear contradiction of our faculties of reason and what else, but the thing that kind of makes it distinct from something like let's say an act or like lying is that, at least somewhat distinct, is that the particular wrongness of it is partially related to some revealed facts of truth. But yeah, that's a great example actually. Idolatry would obviously it's the use of like essentially religious faculty, and it's an act that necessarily frustrates that faculty.
Mm-hmm.
Is there much more we need to add?
what about like intentional drunkenness?
Yeah, that's a good
obviously.
one.
Yeah,
That's similar to the eating disorder case.
Yeah, it's straightforward subversion of reason.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then intentional drug, like non-prescription drug use for recreational.
I mean, drug use may get a bit like what are we including? Like as an example, cigarettes. Will we include those?
Well,
Because
he says like non-prescription. So I guess what he means is things that would usually be prescribed.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
fair enough.
So there are some things where, for the sake of medicine, you can take them even though they will negatively impact your use of reason. Whereas if you're taking them off of prescription for the sake of recreation, it would be
So
wrong.
we're thinking like the same way. I think Quaaludes were originally used as like relaxation for stressed housewives.
Yeah, you couldn't include cigarettes because cigarettes don't distort your use of reason, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas something like, okay, that's not a good example. Something like excessively taking, I don't know, like Adderall off prescription would be a better example at like large doses, or somebody taking like painkillers.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What else can we think of?
I mean, murder is like a direct subversion of like our social faculties.
Yeah, but even aside from murder, just like intentional injury of another out of wrath.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, like I think we've more or less said everything that's that's important for like a decent introduction to this topic. I think we cleared up like some important misunderstandings of the perverted faculty argument. So I guess unless we have any questions in the chat, but I don't think we have. We can probably call it a night.
Okay, yeah.
Sure. And if you want to do this again, on the same topic, and tell me beforehand, I can prepare for it and hopefully be a bit more helpful to you.
All right, no, you were already helpful. Thanks, Hasan. Also, Kayak, you wanted to say something?
No, I didn't. Okay.
Other than that, originally we also wanted to talk about anime, I think, but like,
yeah.
I guess
I was gonna say, can we make that a separate stream, please?
yeah, we're gonna make that a separate stream.
Okay, cool.
So, in that case, good night and God bless.
God bless.